Hello friends, this is Jim with Science Talk. In this video, I want to discuss, I think, a very important person. And probably this person, probably not as well known today as she was half a century ago. And it's a shame, because she was an incredible lady, and she foresaw some of the environmental dangers that we are now dealing with today. Her name is Rachel Carson. She was a marine biologist and a writer, and she is recognized as one of the most important conservationists in history, recognized as the mother of the modern environmental movement, modern environmentalism. Some of you may be familiar with her book, Silent Spring. More on that in a bit. She challenged the use of man-made chemicals, especially pesticides, especially DDT. And her research led to the nationwide ban on DDT and other pesticides. Her environmental movement eventually led to the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, which unfortunately, with the current administration, the EPA is under extreme attack. Science, in fact, is under extreme attack in this nation, unfortunately. The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction, Carson said. She also famously stated, "But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself." Spot on correct. A little background on her life. She was born May 27, 1907 in Springdale, Pennsylvania. She grew up on a 65-acre farm. As a child, she spent her days exploring nature and doing some writing. Her first work was published in a children's magazine when she was 10 years old. This upbringing instilled in her first-hand knowledge of nature and wildlife that spurred her into her life pursuits. In every outthrust headland, in every curving beach, in every grain of sand, there is the story of the earth, said Carson. Originally determined to be a writer, she changed her major from English to biology in college. In 1929, she graduated from the Pennsylvania College for Women, which is now Chatham College. She went on to do graduate work at Johns Hopkins University, which at the time was basically unheard of woman attending. She had her fellowship at the U.S. Marine Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. During her postgraduate studies, she taught at the Johns Hopkins Summer School, and then she began teaching at the University of Maryland, and she did that for about 5 years. After she did her teaching stint at the University of Maryland, she joined the Bureau of Fisheries in 1935. One of her first duties was to create a series of 7-minute radio programs about marine life. They were named Romance Under the Waters. In 1936, she became one of only two women employed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Bureau at a professional level. She eventually became the editor-in-chief of the service's publications. So she was utilizing her interest in writing after all. So she was combining her work as a scientist and her affinity for writing. She stayed at the Fish and Wildlife Service until 1952. Carson also helped the government during World War II by investigating undersea sounds to assist the Navy in developing submarine detection. While working for the government, she penned many articles that were published by the Baltimore Sun. She also wrote her first book, Under the Sea Wind, which was published in 1941. It was a scientific book on marine life, but it was written in such a way that the average person could understand it, thus making it more accessible. Oftentimes, a lot of people complain that when the scientist tries to write a book, it gets a little too bogged down in jargon and becomes a bit inaccessible. By not necessarily dumbing it down, but at least presenting it in a manner, where a lot of the jargon is kind of left out, you can then make it more accessible, so this way get more people interested in it. That to me is one of the greatest talents that Carl Sagan had. He had the ability to explain things without dumbing it down, but that got your interest and held your interest. Same thing with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Stephen Jay Gould, who is one of my scientific heroes, if you will. The way he would write, he wrote this monthly essay for Natural History magazine. He did that for 25 years, never missed a month. That's almost as good as DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak. But he wrote this monthly essay. The title of the column was This View of Life, which is taken directly from the very last sentence of Darwin's Origin of Species. And he would discuss topics of evolutionary interest, and sometimes he would bring in human interest, but weave it in such a way that was just really compelling. And as he would say, he says, I'm not going to dumb it down. He says, I will take the time to explain technical terms, but he says, I trust my audience to be smart enough to get what I'm writing. He wasn't condescending. And I have basically all his essays, and it's still fascinating to read all these years after his passing. That's basically, you could say that she was the first to do this, to present science in a way that gets the non-professionals interested in. And that's important. The more you can get people interested in science, the more people want to go into science, and we need scientists. In 1951, she published her second book, The Sea Around Us. This book was a hit. It became an immediate bestseller, and it did quite well for her. It made her wealthy. The book won a National Book Award, stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 81 weeks, and ended up being translated into 32 languages. In 1955, she published her third book, Under the Sea. She spent the 1950s researching the effects of pesticides on the food chain across the U.S. and Europe with the help of Shirley Briggs, who is the editor of an Audubon Naturalist Society magazine called Atlantic Naturalist, along with Clarence Cottam, who is another former Fish and Wildlife Service employee. This work culminated in probably her most important work, the book Silent Spring, which the New Yorker published as a serial in 1962, basically presenting chapters at a time. It took her 4 years to write. This is according to the Natural Resource Defense Council. In the book, she explained why the use of pesticides was detrimental, paying particular attention to the effects of DDT. Carson asked the important question, do humans have the right to control nature? She also introduced the concept that planet Earth can only sustain pollution levels for a certain amount of time. Let me read an excerpt from Silent Spring. One of the most significant features of DDT and related chemicals is the way they are passed on from one organism to another through all the lengths of the food chains. Fields of alfalfa, say, are dusted with DDT. Meal is later prepared from the alfalfa and fed to hens. The hens lay eggs that contain DDT. or the hay containing residues of from 7 to 8 parts per million may be fed to cows. The DDT will turn up in the milk in the amount of about 3 parts per million, but in butter made from this milk, the concentration may run to 65 parts per million. During the process of transfer, what started out as a very small amount of DDT may end up as a heavy concentration. The poison, which is what it is, the poison may be passed on from mother to offspring. The presence of insecticide residues in human milk has been established by the Food and Drug Administration scientists. What she is talking about there is the concept of bioaccumulation, where pesticides, pollutants, whatever the situation may be, will be concentrated as you move up through the different trophic levels in the food chain, the food web. I've discussed this before, but it is a concept that's worth repeating. Bioaccumulation concentrates pesticides, pollutants, as it moves up through the different trophic levels, thereby reaching harmful levels when ingested by whatever the organism may be. She was the one who first stated that. And also, DDT had the other effect of making the shells, the egg shells themselves, thinner, so that when the bird would try to, sit on it with their brood pouch to incubate it, just the weight of the bird was causing the eggs to break apart, thereby destroying the chick, the developing chick. So as a result of that, bird populations, especially the birds who hunt, the ospreys, the bald eagles, hawks, and so forth, their numbers were plummeting. And now these birds are found near the top of the food chain. Again, reinforcing the idea of bioaccumulation through the trophic levels, that by the time he got up to the ospreys and the eagles, they were ingesting very high concentrations of the stuff, and it was damaging their eggs to the point that they were having reproductive failures. And then they had reproductive failure year after year after year. The adults eventually die off, and where's the next generation? So that was the other thing that she pointed out, in addition to the bioaccumulation, the fact that the pesticides was thinning the eggshells of the birds. This book, Silent Spring, earned her a presidential commission, giving her thoughts great credibility in the scientific world. Chemical companies tried to discredit Carson as a communist or hysterical woman, and we saw the same thing with the tobacco and the nicotine, and we're seeing the same sort of silly nonsense with the climate change deniers. Where you get these people who will take some quirk of data or some little anomaly in the data and say, see, that proves that you guys are all full of it. Well, no. Look at the long trend. Look at understand statistics and understand scientific concepts. Despite the efforts, around 15 million viewers tuned into the CBS Reports TV special that was broadcast April 3rd, 1963, entitled The Silent Spring of Rachel Carson. Later, Carson was asked to testify before a congressional committee about the effects of pesticide. This led to the banning of DDT, and she received medals from the National Audubon Society, American Geographical Society. And Carson was also inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And unfortunately, she succumbed to breast cancer on April 14th, 1964, in Silver Spring, Maryland. She did not live long enough to see the environmental revolution created by Silent Spring, such as Earth Day or the creation of the EPA, as I mentioned at the outset of this video. And the EPA was created in 1970. Under the presidency of all people, Richard Nixon. So think about it. Richard Nixon created the EPA. He passed the Clean Air and Clean Waters Act in Title IX. Too bad he was paranoid. Anyway, also, in 1966 in Maine, the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge was created. Carson once stated in a television interview, "Man's endeavors to control nature by his powers, to alter and to destroy, would inevitably evolve into a war against himself, a war he would lose unless he came to terms with nature." Humans keep forgetting we are a part of nature. We are not separate from nature. We are every bit part of the ecosystem, and what we do impacts the ecosystem. Now, Silent Spring was published in basically 1962, as I just mentioned, and she died 2 years later. But she was ill during the preparation of the book, and she basically willed herself to complete it as best as she can, because she did suffer quite a bit from the ravages of the cancer in her last remaining years. It is interesting to note that as she reflected on her accomplishments towards the end of her life, she wanted to write a book, and listen to this. This is really prescient. She wanted to write a book about the rising sea levels, noting and observing the climate is changing. She knew it. She saw it back then. It's been known for a while what CO2 does as far as trapping heat, increasing the temperature. But she made the connection to rising sea levels, either through thermal expansion of the water and or melting of glaciers with the fresh water input into the oceans. But she made the connection back then. She really was a visionary. She was definitely the first prominent environmentalist, and one who recognized that changes in the climate were coming. And said, it is a shame that she did not live to see Earth Day, that she did not live to see the EPA, the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts passed, the EPA founded. Let's also remember that there was another important event that helped create Earth Day, and that was Apollo 8. When Apollo 8, they traveled to the moon just to, basically it was a testing of the navigational procedures and orbital mechanics and so forth. When Apollo 8 came around from the backside of the moon, the dark side of the moon, what did they see out their window? They saw the dark, gray, lifeless moonscape in front of them, and in the background was planet Earth, with the bright blue, the whites of the clouds. You can even see some of the greens of the savannas. And they took a photo. It became known as Earthrise. It's kind of a gibbous Earth that we see. And that drove home the concept of how fragile this planet is, and that we better start being better stewards of this planet, start taking better care of Mother Earth, because it's our only home we have, and if we basically crap in our own beds, that's not good. And unfortunately, that is what humans have been doing. So, in my view, not only Rachel Carson was extremely important in getting the environmental movement underway. That famous photograph of Earthrise from Apollo 8 was very instrumental as well. But I wanted to share with you a little bit about Rachel Carson. I think she was one of the most important scientists of the 20th century. Her legacy lives on, I think, even though her name may not be as well known today as it was back then. But her effects, her vision of the future, what she foresaw coming, is all the more prescient and applicable to today. Basically, her message of stop waging war. Humans have got to stop waging war against itself. When you destroy the environment, when you degrade the environment, you are degrading human civilization as well. Thank you for watching. Please share this video, subscribe, click on the bell so that you get notified when I drop a video. Please go to patreon.com/Science Talk with Jim Massa and become a patron. If you are already a patron, thank you for your continued support. Talk soon.